Welcome to the Historical Movies Podcast, a podcast all about movies inspired by history. I'm Ross Evans, I'm an editor, and I'm joined by Professor of Modern History at Liverpool Hope University and historical scriptwriter, Bryce Evans. Bryce, are you wearing a wig?
I'm not wearing a wig or powder, and I've no macaroons or champagne in front of me.
Well, we might need them because in today's episode, it's Marie Antoinette. Let them eat cake, let them wear blue converse sneakers. In this movie about a famous 18th century Queen of France, around the 55-minute mark, there's a shot of Kirsten Dunst's feet, and in the background, there's a pair of blue all-star converse sneakers or trainers. And maybe that's one shot that sums up this film. Because unlike the film we watched last time, Bryce, which was Braveheart, which is basically telling you the entire time how to feel and what to think as you're going through it, this film is a little bit more open to interpretation. Let me ask you, how did you get on with Marie Antoinette?
Well, first of all, I must admit I missed the Converse trainers on Kirsten Dunst. I think in terms of its subject matter, I should make a disclaimer here. I think a lot of people, in terms of how they are politically, actually, and how they view history, can be fundamentally divided on whether they think the French Revolution was, broadly speaking, a good thing or a bad thing. I generally think that. And I should make it clear from the start, I think the French Revolution, broadly speaking, not to defend its horrible tyrannical excesses, was, generally speaking, a progressive good thing. So I have to admit to bias here. I'm not immediately well disposed to the subject of this movie as a royalist martyr. And also, another disclaimer, Ross, I am not and never was a teenage girl. So, bearing all that in mind, and with those caveats, I actually really quite like this movie. And the reason I liked it, and we can perhaps contest this is a theme we keep coming back to on this podcast, and it's the question of historical accuracy. And I thought, accepting your point about the Converse sneakers and maybe the punky soundtrack, in the round, in its depiction of boredom, excess, and frivolity, this is probably one of the most accurate historical movies I've ever seen.
Yes, I'm thinking of changing the title of this podcast to the Is This Historically Accurate podcast. Well, this is a film for me that where the style completely overpowers the plot or character development. The costumes, which are apparently mostly historically accurate, but with colourful and playful twists here and there, of course, won an Academy Award for Best Costume in 2006. I think that was a gimme, basically. I was very relieved that this wasn't a stuffy period movie. And actually, it's as a film, it's actually so much better than that. It's obviously made for a teen audience. And it's made to engage people about history, which may not be, who may otherwise have no interest in it. You know, as I mentioned Braveheart, I was actually just thinking when I was watching this, just to briefly come back to the point I made at the beginning, what is the Venn diagram of people who watch Braveheart and Marie Antoinette? It's probably two completely separate circles, or at least not much of an overlap. And it's not a movie I would usually choose to watch, but I did enjoy it. And actually, it made me think. I left this movie with more than just a sensation. A lot of movies these days just give you an experience, which is fine. But this makes you think a little bit more. What is the movie trying to say? Is it glamorizing royalty? Is it actually showing how repressive that is in terms of the themes of loneliness and this kind of suffocating formality? The fact that a point here I should also make is I don't know whether Marie Antoinette actually gave birth in a room full of people, but I can imagine it happened like that. So, at the same time, it does show, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, Bryce, it does show Marie Antoinette in a pretty heroic light. Firstly, as a child who is, not even engaged of what's going on. But secondly, there's a scene at the end where the mob are about to break in, and she tells one of the panicking maids, "Don't be frightened." And it seemed to me that it was in Marie Antoinette's corner. What did you think about that?
I don't really agree, actually. I certainly don't think it was a heroic portrayal. I don't even think it's a rehabilitation as much as a satire. I think it's got to be viewed as a satire. And that's in that way I enjoyed it. Look, feminist historians often talk. We all know that women have been written out of history, but unfortunately, there's a sort of tendency within some women's history to talk of quote unquote remarkable women. As if every single woman who is rescued from the condescension of posterity have to be remarkable. Well, Marie Antoinette is really quite unremarkable. That's why I like this movie. She is symbolic of how grotesque and stupid monarchy is. She's a bit of a dope. She's not very well read. The Austrians, where she comes from, they're very good at marrying off their offspring. She's a political pawn. She's a teenage commodity. She has this marriage, no kid for 7 years, and then she becomes a womb. I think satirizing that. It's not like say it's not unsympathetic, but one of the criticisms of the movie by Evelyn Lever, a French historian, said that Marie Antoinette did not spend her time just eating pastries and drinking champagne. But it's kind of sour grapes, actually, because Sofia Coppola chose not her book, but Antonia Fraser, fine historian Antonia Fraser's book. And that's why I think it is one of the most accurate films. It's boring in large parts. Her life is frivolous and terribly boring. It's slow, it's cakes, it's shoes, it's interminable parlour games. But I take that personally as a satire on the crass ridiculousness of the system that it's portraying. The accident of birth, which portrays this, propels this little girl into this situation. And for that reason, I think it's the most, I suppose, honest and accurate movie in some ways that we've yet scrutinised.
The question I want to ask is, I think you've already answered. I was going to ask whether it does her a disservice. I only want to ask that again because I read that she was involved to some extent, at least, in the politics of the time, advising her husband. It's not since, I think, 1610 a Queen of France had done that. So, and she was also resistant of reform. So doesn't this movie sort of deny her a bit of agency? Because in this movie, she seems to be childish to the extent that she is sort of absolved from all of these problems that are happening around her. Is that a fair criticism or unfair?
For me, no. I think there's a lot of court historians make these grand attempts to rehabilitate people like Marie Antoinette. They weren't great people. She never had to strive for the position she occupies. In that role, she was wanton in her spending and understandably became an object of derision and violence from the mob. Was she scapegoated? Of course. The mob needed a scapegoat. It was Rousseau who coined the term "let them eat cake," not her. And, that's rebutted in the movie. But, she wasn't well read. She was a bit of a pawn. She was a victim. She was a victim of gossip and libel and pornography. But even by the standards of the time, she was ridiculously self-indulgent. And I don't have a lot of sympathy for Marie Antoinette, and I suppose on a human level, but I think that's the whole point of this movie, that it is, okay, the film advances, characters age, she loses her innocence ground, there is a progression there. But for me, when we get onto the best scenes, is Steve Coogan, of course, who plays the Austrian ambassador, describing in detail not even in detail, the geopolitical situation in Europe, what's going on in Poland, etc. And she responds by asking him if he likes the design on her sleeves. And I have to say, I don't think she was much more than that, actually. I'm sure in some regard she offered some advice. I've read that she has been done a disservice, but she was. This is the whole point of the movie is satirizing this nonsense system where an accident of birth propels people to positions where they're supposed to be qualified via bloodline to advise on geopolitical strategy. It's lovely in its satire there. At one point she says this is ridiculous. That's the whole point. It is ridiculous. Her life is ridiculous.
Yes, this is ridiculous. This, madame, is Versailles, as comes the reply. Is it a problem that this film doesn't have any of the background of the French Revolution? Is it a problem that we don't see the mob until, I think, the last 5 minutes of the film? We see no people other than the aristocracy until the last 5 minutes of the film, and then it's just silhouettes.
Good question. Now, I often ask my students, Marie Antoinette let them eat cake. Does it actually matter whether she said that or she didn't say that? I think it's pretty well established that she never said that. But does it actually matter? Because whether she did or she didn't, she was symbolic of decadent negligence, and the mob perceived her to have uttered those words. Which brings me on to the mob. Is then the absence of the mob a problem, or the people, or the political currents? Now, I kind of searched long and hard for this, because there's movies which I've watched, and a good example is Steve McQueen's film Hunger, about the hunger striker, the IRA activist Bobby Sands. And one of my big problems with Hunger, which is just sort of Bobby Sands starving himself to death, Michael Fassbender, and the battle of wills between him and the prison warden, is that it's just about that. It's completely devoid of political context. And I was asking myself, why did I have such a problem with Hunger and its lack of political context? And why does the lack of political context bother me less in Marie Antoinette? And I think it comes back to the point that someone like Bobby Sands, whatever you think of him, was someone who was propelled into a situation because he was resisting his status as a second-class citizen in his own country, which is why he was in that situation in the first place. Marie Antoinette is a dope whose privilege is purely an accident of birth. And the only world she would have known is the world of cakes and champagne and shoes and playing around on her little farm with her friends. And for that reason, I actually thought this was a really good movie. We're even denied her getting her head chopped off. But I actually thought it didn't matter for me, because it's portraying the world she knew, which was so insular and so isolated and so closeted and so awfully privileged. And I think that's why, because of its subject matter, I don't actually have a problem with the political context comes in dribs and drabs, doesn't it? But, we never get, big scenes. We never get the storming of the Bastille. But I think I have less of a problem with that because, again, I think I take it as a satire, not unsympathetic satire, but a satire of the ridiculousness of the social system she is a symbol of.
There's another aspect of this film. I mean, it was striking to me that it shares some quite strong resemblances to Barry Lyndon, which I know is a film that Sofia Coppola, the director, was heavily influenced by. One thing we haven't covered, and probably because we're not the best people to ask about this, but Roger Ebert, the venerated film critic, said about this film that it's about the loneliness of being female and surrounded by a world that knows how to use you but not how to value and understand you. So there's also another aspect to the film, away from the historical stuff, away from the political stuff, and that's about the experience of being a woman. And it's especially striking to me that this was made back in 2006, and as you can imagine, Hollywood was a less equal place back then than it was now, and in fact, I don't think it's that equal now either. But so there's again, we're probably not. It's probably not the greatest platform to answer that question, Bryce. But what did you pick up on about those themes of I don't want to say womanhood, but I'm talking about the loneliness, the alienation of the female. Maybe you could talk in a kind of historical sense about that.
Well, I think it probably conveys that very well, the loneliness of the teenage girl in her bedroom, the desires, the sex life. I think it's actually a really good, depiction of teenage femininity, but also then the coming of age as a woman. I think there's some really good, strong female choices there. The Australian comic actress Rose Byrne as the best mate, I think, is a really good comic choice. So I think, I think it's about being female. It's about, there's a really funny scene where she's constantly trying to get the ride off her husband, who's not interested, and he's just a nerd who's lying in bed, and he's reading his book on locks. Again, quite accurate. Louis XVI was a nerd who was into his locks, and she's sort of trying to get him to do the business, and he sort of turns for 60. Yeah, it's incredible. Did you know that they used to make locks out of wood? And it's almost like the depiction of male-female relationships in the age of the iPhone. And I think, because you can almost see the book he's reading as an iPhone in bed. And I think, again, like I said, disclaimer, I've never been a teenage girl, but I think it really, displays and conveys those emotions in a really nice way. I think it shows that it's a female filmmaker as well. I think it shows in actually the lack of willingness to tell absolute whoppers, which we've seen in other movies, because there's I don't think there's any absolute whoppers here. That's why I like it. It's honest and it's accurate. There's an honesty there. I also think in terms of the soundtrack is very much, Sofia Coppola's teenage girl soundtrack of the 80s, the punky soundtrack. So there's an honesty and an integrity there. The pastel colours she uses, the pinks and the blues, the mood, it's emotional. It's a very feminine movie like that. And I suppose on those terms, I think it really succeeds. Now, that has been one of the criticisms of it, that Sofia Coppola, who made her acting debut, a terrible performance, cast by Daddy in Godfather 3, and she's awful, commonly regarded as a terrible performance, and then sort of slips into a directorial career by dint of the fact that she is of the Coppola dynasty, and what I'm getting at here is that a lot of the criticism of Coppola's movies they're the same theme, which is, look at me, I'm a poor little rich girl. Oh, a poor little rich girl, which this is in some ways, the poor little rich girl. But I don't think it's legitimate criticism on that level, because I think there's an honesty about, especially teenage female desire and emotion, which is conveyed really, really well. Yes,
the Coppola brood putting every European monarchy to shame in terms of
nepotism.
Yeah. Well, maybe, but certainly in terms of if you just look at Sofia Coppola list of notable relatives on Wikipedia, it's as long as her arm, the list. So it's certainly in terms of notable relatives, maybe putting the European monarchies to shame. So this movie had a budget of $40 million, made $61 million at the box office, and as we said, won the Academy Award for Best Costume Design. Is this the greatest wigs movie ever made? Wigs as in hair pieces? I think so. I think it's got to be. I was actually trying to dig down and find the budget for the wigs, but I couldn't actually find a figure for that. Maybe it's
definitely the greatest pudding movie ever made. The amount of puddings discarded, scoffed, pecked at all through the movie. Let them eat cake, bread shortages, all the rest. There's a message there. Definitely one of the best cake movies of all time.
Absolutely. I was actually sitting down to watch this with my little notebook that I make notes in, and I was trying to work out what was going on with the music. I was trying to work out, okay, so this is a modern piece now, then it goes to a classical piece, then it goes to something that's, diegetic, in the environment that you'd be able to hear, and then it goes back to a modern piece, and I was thinking, well, there's got to be some kind of rhyme or reason to this. Maybe the modern stuff is when we're alone with Marie Antoinette. Anyway, I couldn't find any link, and I kind of came to the realization that I'm trying to analyze this in the wrong way. I'm trying to look at it like a Braveheart film, which is something you should never do. And you just have to kind of get absorbed into its world and let it tell you, or let it show you what it wants to show, and then you have a think about it afterwards.
Exactly.
And,
in a very, dare I say, very feminine way. It's about the feelings. It's about the mood. Yeah. More than that stuff. And just on that point of the soundtrack, it's indulgent from Coppola. It's probably her 1980s teenage soundtrack, and sometimes it's a little bit too obvious, we want candy and all the rest. But the alternative would be, wouldn't it, the same old Baroque stuff, a bit of Mozart and a bit of Haydn and the other sort of, dozen, standard Baroque tunes. And you kind of, I thought, yeah, well, fair enough, stick a bit of punk in there.
Yeah, as I said at the top, the other way to do this as a stuffy period piece would have been extremely dull. And that movie's been made, I think, many times before. Two other notes I had before we get on to our list of questions we ask of every movie. Marie Antoinette's disguise at the masked ball is almost as bad as Clark Kent's glasses as Superman. The other point I have to bring up is the scene where they brew the jasmine tea. I mean, that's a brew time of about 8 seconds. That's going to taste awful. That's just going to be hot water, basically.
Well, I know you love your tea. You love your tea.
Yes. So, what was your favourite scene?
I think I love the scene with Steve Coogan really sums up. It's so good in terms of explaining the lack of political context. Just the ignorance of this woman, I think, and I think that was really good. Favorite scene, I mean, I have to admit, like I come back to this point. It was a really boring movie. It's a boring movie. It is boring.
Certainly the first hour. I mean, I think it needed about 2 or 3 minutes cut out, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that would speed up the whole thing a lot.
So there's no big, like you said before, there's no sort of big walloping scenes in this, in terms of, big speeches. Even sort of the deathbed scene with Rip Torn is a bit sort of understated, Louis XV. But I think my favourite scene actually... and in terms of the fact that I'm taking this as a satire, I'm not taking this as a rehabilitation of Marie Antoinette, who's a subject I have very little time for, but I'm taking it as a satire. And in line with satire, I think my favourite scene has to be the early scene amongst the noble women when she's getting changed at her bedchamber at Versailles, and there's a one-upmanship due to title and status as to who gets to dress her. And I just think if you're taking this film as a satire, which I, as a historian, am very much, I think that really was the standout scene for me. How about yourself?
Well, I've got the scene that I remember the most maybe because it's at the end of the film, but it's when they're eating their dinner, their lavish dinner, with the sound of the mob outside. And that whole sequence then that goes and the film, the final shot of the movie, which is that shot of the wrecked bedroom, and I like the fact that it's a bedroom because that symbolizes where the baby making happens, and that's basically what the main role of these women were, baby making machines. And that the wrecked image of the bedroom is as if that wrecked bedroom symbolizes how this life will wreck you.
You didn't feel a little bit shortchanged that we didn't get to see her, the head of this, useless Austrian noblewoman lobbed off unceremoniously?
No, I'll come back to that a bit later. But it actually ends with that. It's not actually a still frame, but I'm just thinking again of Barry Lyndon. Sorry to keep bringing that up, but that ends as a still frame, as in it is literally paused as a still frame, and so. That gave me Lyndon vibes. But no, that was my favourite scene, or that whole sequence right until the end was my favourite. You mentioned... should we just hop on to that point then? We have a question here. What would the sequel be? Well, hasn't the sequel got to be Napoleon? Because we covered Napoleon, the first scene of which is Marie Antoinette getting beheaded. So, much like Barbenheimer, you could watch Marie Antoinette followed by Napoleon of a weekend, and that's basically, again, talking about Venn diagrams, no two people would necessarily be in that for watching those two films. A teen flick period piece meets a incel Redditor's wet dream. So there we go. So that would be my sequel. How about yours?
Well, similarly, I have to say, I know it's completely missing. Contradicting myself here. It's missing entirely the point of the film, but nonetheless, after sitting through some very boring sequences, I did feel shortchanged by not getting her head lobbed off. But that would be my sequel, is her death, really. On a human level, sad, head shaved. immiserated, taken to the guillotine. I mean, what better way to represent her fall from grace? But I get that it's not in there, and I get it in the sense that it's something we've described before. We've described on this pod before how the beautiful way, or sometimes not so accurate, a beautiful way in which paintings inspire movies, and a lot of this movie, which is very art house. I mean, we're not going to get terribly pretentious here, but a lot of it based on the work of French fashion photographer Guy Bourdin. Allegedly, I'm not really familiar with his work, but you can see that, can't you? You can see that the art house inspiration, the fashion inspiration, and the insistence of Coppola to film at Versailles rather than a cheaper venue. They wanted to film a cheaper venue in Bulgaria, somewhere in Eastern Europe. And I like movies that let the set and the scenery and nature occasionally, and colours, you get some great sunsets here, speak for themselves. So I get all of that. Having said that, and it's understated and it's beautiful and it's feminine and it's about emotion. However, having said all that, I do still want to see her head get lopped off.
While you were talking there, I was just thinking it must have been extremely tempting as a filmmaker to bring in the most dramatic scenes of Marie Antoinette's life. And it's, I suppose, I've never really thought about this, but I suppose it's very brave of a director to say, no, we're going to ignore all that stuff and we're going to make a film about her and sort of completely focus on her life through teenage girl glasses. Who was your favourite performance?
I thought long and hard about this. I thought I was wondering about Steve Coogan, because I know he was in Tristram Shandy. I wonder, was this one of his first, post sort of Partridge and that kind of stuff? Is this one of his first film roles? I'm not sure.
I think so.
I think he's pretty good as the Austrian ambassador, but I'm not going to go for that probably because a bit of a predictable choice. I think the husband's very good. The nerdy, uninterested Louis XVI. I actually think it's Kirsten Dunst. I think it's really well cast. I think she's the perfect person to cast in that role with her sort of very, nubile appearance, great actress with sort of the dimples and all the rest. It was sounding like some sort of pervy old man here, but she's perfect for that role. And I think for me, she's the standout performer. How about you?
I would agree. Yeah, I would also. I was also thinking about Rip Torn. I was not expecting to see him in this film. I'm not sure he knows what accent he was going for in this movie, but it doesn't really matter. I have to come back at you about Jason Schwartzman. He's the guy who played Louis XVI. There are some points in this film in which I think his delivery is atrocious. But then I think maybe that's the point, because, I mean, he is supposed to be a pretty pathetic kind of figure. Yeah. He is Bryce. Also, I should mention, the cousin of Sofia Coppola.
Oh, so maybe
that's again. There we go. There
again,
it is.
The Coppola nepotism. But there's some big names, right, who have real just like cameos in this. The likes of your big sexy boys like Tom Hardy and.
But this is early in the career, I think, of Tom Hardy, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's a good point.
And who's the other guy? The Irish guy who's in it? She has an affair with. But no, absolutely early in their career. But yeah, I think for me it's Kirsten Dunst. Yeah.
What's the best companion film to watch with this one? There is a 1938 Marie Antoinette film, the trailer of which I've seen. Maybe not in a historical way, but obviously some of Sofia Coppola's other films may be lost in translation, which also very strikingly deals with loneliness and alienation. Maybe something like that. Well,
I suppose, I mean, again, I prefer this to Lost in Translation. I know a lot of people view Lost in Translation as her masterpiece. Again, I find it very, very boring. A lot of this I find very boring, but I get the point, and it works on an emotional level for me. She's done some more sort of in-your-face kind of rich girl movies, like The Bling Ring, which may be the kind of companion piece maybe we need for this, in the sense that it's a movie, like say, about a poor little rich girl made by a poor little rich girl.
I'm interested to know what you gave this out of 10.
No, I agonised over this because it's like on this pod a lot of the time where she says I didn't want to make one of these overblown biopics, and a lot of time on this pod we're talking about these overblown very male biopics. So and I think I get it. I think I get it as a satire, and so I thought about this. I think I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10 overall.
I thought you would have gone a bit higher, but then again, I suppose this is a good example of a film which might not necessarily score highly. It's almost like it's kind of one of those films that you don't necessarily enjoy, but you're glad you had the experience, and you sort of think about it afterwards, which sounds counterintuitive, but some of those are the best films ever made.
Exactly. I found it sickening, actually. This arcane, divine right, royal nonsense, macaroons, champagnes, ridiculously ugly toy dogs. I didn't really enjoy it as an experience, even on the sort of emotional level or the color palette level, which I've just been describing. So I'm going to give it a 6 because it's not something I'd rush to rewatch. Actually, I really wouldn't.
I don't think.
How many would you give it out of 10?
I would go along with that. I would have gone for a 6. I thought you would give it a bit higher, but it's a 6 for me. As I said before, I think that it's just a little bit too childish portrayal, personally, for me.
Well, it's frivolous and slow and boring. It's cakes, shoes. It's interminable parlor games. It's not something I have any identification with, really, on any great level. But I maybe I'm being a bit unfair there with 6 out of 10. Maybe I go. Could I inch up to a 6.5? Maybe.
Yeah, if you like, no problem. So, what are we putting in our Hall of Fame?
Well, I think it has to be the ridiculously ugly toy dogs. One of the great scenes in this is when, which is accurate to history. When this scene, very first scene, when she is a teenage commodity, the changeover between Austria and France takes place. It actually takes place in real life on an island in the Rhine, where she's stripped and dressed as a French dauphine, has to say goodbye to her old Austrian retinue, and of course violins playing here, her little doggy. And I think dogs loom large in this movie, scoffing the remnants of the cakes. Some really ugly inbred dogs, which talks to the broader human theme as well. So I think for me it's the ugly toy dogs which would have to go in our Hall of Fame.
Nicely bridged. I wonder how you were going to put that when you talked about inbred dogs. Yes, actually, her dog at the beginning is called Mops, which is just German for pug. The breed of dog in pug the name is Mops, so her dog is called Pug. I did hear on, and I didn't check this. I'm ashamed to say I didn't check my sources, but I did hear on another movie podcast that dog won the Palm Dog that year. I'm not sure if that's true or what, but did you hear that or? No, I didn't. No, I didn't read that. I think that's a good category we could include. I actually was in the week. I was thinking that I've come up with a new category, but it doesn't fit this film. It's the Nobel Prize for movie physics, but it would have worked in Braveheart.
Yeah,
it would have worked in Braveheart. It doesn't work in this film.
No.
For the Hall of Fame, well, I had the insanely massive wig that she wears. That's made by Leonard. James Lance, who's also in Alan Partridge there. If it's not that, I thought maybe there's a scene where they're one of their feasting scenes, and there's a giant peacock on the table. I don't know if they're eating it or whether it's stuffed. I don't know, but I thought that would look good in the living room. And I also have to include, as you've mentioned, Louis XVI's engrossing lockbook. So engrossing that he didn't have sex with his wife for 7 years. But yes.
One of the criticisms, I think, of the movie in terms of its accuracy, I have read this, is that the wigs weren't big enough.
Oh, really? Well, they did get ludicrously large. They got larger and larger, didn't they? I read, but yeah. Well, there we go. Well, then I'll have to have 2 of them to make up for it. We've talked about a sequel. Do you have anything for Sude's Corner, Bryce?
Well, I always loved Sude's Corner, and usually I'm rummaging through the archives of The Guardian and its film critics. But this week it's Entertainment Weekly's Lisa Schwartzbaum, who writes, and I quote, "Marie Antoinette is the work of a mature filmmaker who has identified and developed a new cinematic vocabulary to describe a new breed of post-feminist woman."
Hang on, how many posts were there?
3 posts. Post-feminist woman. And it took me quite a long time to decipher this. I think it just means she's not a feminist. and that she's a sort of rich girl who falls upwards. So it's Sofia Coppola. I think that's kind of what it's getting at in its lauding of post feminist.
Well, it's good because the other question I have here is best five-a-side football team name, and I didn't have one until he said that. So now we've got post feminist woman goal as the team name. Thank you very much.
Really good. I've got one of those actually this week because usually they're your realm. Now, so I'm a little unversed in this. So be kind, be gentle. Let them eat halftime Jaffa cakes.
That's very good.
When you played football, did you get halftime Jaffa? For a couple of teams I played for in the past, there's always Jaffa cakes. Okay, so it doesn't. Okay,
Jaffa cakes and tea, Jasmine tea, not brewed long enough. We've got nothing for this film. I'm guessing. I don't think the military historians went bananas for this one.
No, thank goodness. There's nothing for them to critique in this because it's a palace piece, isn't it?
Yeah.
All I can say is that, in summary of this movie, thank goodness we've gotten rid of this rotten, ridiculous, arcane, royalist nonsense. Oh wait, no, we haven't. Still in Britain.
We're not getting an MBE anytime soon, Bryce. That was great fun. Thank you very much. And we shall see you next time on the Historical Movies Podcast.